As a physician, you're trained to cure people, not only to treat. And and particularly as a young physician dealing with young people, it was extremely hard to not be able to cure anybody. I stopped seeing patients in '94. We started with UNAIDS, and every single of my patients is dead, because there were no antiretrovirals in these days, or no effective treatment. And it was very hard. But I would say that I concentrated on a few things. One, I learned how to care, not only to cure. And care, and help people with taking decisions to, for the end of their life. But also, I became very upset about the absurd and obscene stigma, discrimination, which in the beginning I thought was about AIDS, but today I know it's not about AIDS. It's about sexuality, it's about homosexuality. And it's probably because people have a problem with their own sexuality. And also I became very early on convinced that the answer to this epidemic is with the people who are either infected, living with it, or affected, and the most at risk. I always think, united and together we are stronger. And so I was there when the International AIDS Society was founded. I went to every single International AIDS conference. We were also fairly isolated. Most of the people working on AIDS were quite young. The established research groups, they didn't usually want to deal with it, and certainly not with issues around HIV prevention, transmission, and so on. So we soon became a quite tight group of probably 30-year-olds, something like that, about the same age as many of the people who were living with HIV. So that's how I became involved. The early 90s, and when I was president of the IAS, were among the darkest years in the history of AIDS. The epidemic continued to expand. Every year, X millions more infected, X millions more dying, new explosions of HIV in the former Soviet Union. South Africa started, because that only started around the 1990s and the end of apartheid. In China it started. We didn't know, is this going to be a major disaster or will be this contained? So that's one thing. And there was no treatment. We had some hope because AZT had come on the market as a single treatment, but the initial hopes were soon vanished, and we were all disappointed because of development of resistance. We didn't know then that you needed at least 3 drugs to prevent the virus from becoming resistant to the treatment given. So there was also hardly any money. We were talking about $200 to $300 million per year for the whole world. And we were happy when there was $10 million more than now. We talk about billions. I remember when in 2000 at the AIDS conference in Durban, when I called for a shift from the M word to the B word, from millions to billions, officials in the National Development Agency called me and said, "Yeah, this is irresponsible. Someone in your position shouldn't do that." And today we're talking about the Global Fund needs billions, 15 billion, and just that's normal. So it were very difficult days, but I always felt that we had to keep the hope alive, invest in research, and do whatever we can in terms of community mobilization. Science has undoubtedly changed the trajectory of the AIDS epidemic, in the first place with the discovery of highly active antiretroviral therapy, came on the market in '96. But also with blood tests, for blood screening, and demonstrating that prevention works, harm reduction, needle exchange. That's all science, all kinds of science. But we failed also We failed to produce a vaccine, and I strongly believe that we will not end this epidemic without an effective vaccine. We still don't have a cure. But we've also recent breakthroughs in terms of the science of HIV prevention, with the microbicides, with pre-exposure prophylaxis. But where we are not doing that well in terms of science is the science of management, of implementation. Okay, treatment as prevention works. We've seen that in discordant couples. But we don't know whether this will work in a, in a large-scale population. What does it take for people to take treatment their whole life, particularly if they're healthy, they feel healthy? And we're also failing, I think, in terms of reaching the most affected groups. That's maybe not so much of a science issue, but I think the politics are as important as science. So science without political engagement is not going to reach the people, and the politics without scientific support is really risky. And that's where there is also a big role for the IAS to play, because the IAS is also a voice of science in AIDS. I remember when, both when I was president of IAS or I was head of UNAIDS, most cases there were demonstrations and I was challenged and so on. Yeah, that was not always very pleasant, to say so, because there are often personal attacks. But on the other hand, it moved the cause. It was really what we needed. And today I don't see that anymore. And I wonder why. Is it because, because a result of the fact that people die less, although 1.7 million people, that's 5,000 people a day died from AIDS last year. I think also as an AIDS movement we have to redefine the AIDS response. I also am very worried about a lot of the talk about the end of AIDS. The Economist had it at its front page a couple of years ago, and it was with a question mark. But people forget about the question mark, and what the story in the street or at the barber is that, oh, AIDS is over. And even if I'm convinced that we can do much better, we can bring down the number of new infections, new deaths to much lower levels, I think we have to be very careful when we are going to position what we're doing as the end of AIDS is in sight, AIDS-free generation and so on. These are long-term goals, but please let's not promise that that's a matter of a few years. It's a matter of decades, and it will require some further scientific breakthroughs. I don't believe we have the tools to end this epidemic now. We need a cure, we need a vaccine, and we need to continue to invest in research, in addition to the much needed community work. And the fact that we see that sex workers, drug users, and gay men, men of sex with men in many countries, we don't even reach them. We don't even reach them with the simplest prevention tools, and certainly not with treatment. So we still have a long way to go. I think the IAS played a big role in two ways. One, to be the voice of science and of reason in the whole AIDS debate. For example, when President Mbeki and a group of American scientists particularly said that, doubted that HIV was causing AIDS, and the IAS stood up and mobilized the scientific community. Secondly, helped enormously with leadership against AIDS, helped with putting AIDS on the political agenda, gave respectability to the AIDS issue, the credibility of the voice of scientists. And I would say add a third one. It is to bring together AIDS researchers. There was a lot of rivalry, and we were not always very united, speaking with one voice as AIDS researchers and AIDS clinicians. I think the IAS has has brought us together, and that's also extremely important. And it's important that we stick together now, because we're in there for the long haul and for some difficult times, but we should be really proud of the achievements which we must continue.